Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends on the West Coast. Welcome to our presentation on how to build a kick-ass guest experience. In this webinar, you'll learn how to become a standout brand by building a kick-ass guest experience culture. We'll share best practices and stories and success stories from companies who've done just that. My name is Charles Summers. It's my pleasure to be serving as your moderator during this hour. If you want to get in touch with me about future webinar topics, Outmatch specific information, or if you'd like to speak with one of our many talent experts, feel free to reach out by email at csummers@outmatch.com or just chat in your comments. Outmatch transforms hiring and development with predictive people analytics, helping organizations make the very best possible decisions about their talent. We provide WePow video interviewing, pre-hire assessments, automated reference checking, culture analytics, and leadership assessments and simulations through the #1 people analytics platform on the market. These technologies work together to identify the right talent and develop them into future leaders at the world's most iconic brands like American Airlines, HCA Healthcare, Walmart, Wyndham Hotels, just to name a few. As Outmatch's capabilities continue to grow, we'd like you to grow with us. So when you have a chance, head to the website, sign up for a future webinar, and get a demo. You can sign up for a demo at outmatch.com/schedule a demo. As a thank you for attending today, you'll get a free copy of 7 Steps to Writing a Culture Handbook. This ebook will guide you through the process of defining and documenting your culture so that leaders, employees, and new hires are all on the same page, which is an essential starting point for delivering a kick-ass guest experience. This is attached in the handout section of your status window. I'll also send out an email. We have a few other materials that we'll go through today. So look for an email from me after today's webinar. It'll have the slides from today's presentation as well. Also, please take a moment to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Outmatch HCM. We're always posting the latest trends, best practices, and insights on hiring and talent management, and we'd love to hear from you. You can also interact with us during the presentation using the questions queued in your GoToWebinar status window. Please feel free to ask questions, make comments, or share feedback. You can also ask questions or leave comments on social media. Today's presentation will take approximately 30 minutes, and following that, we'll have some time set aside for audience questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Cheryl Oxley. Cheryl is an experienced talent management professional who helps big name clients like Boston Market, Brinker International, Panera Bread, Club Corp, Lifetime Fitness, and Wyndham Hotels create an even stronger guest experience culture. This year alone, Cheryl has built guest-focused hiring profiles and tailored assessments for 3 big restaurant brands. So at this time, I'd like to hand it off to Cheryl. Cheryl?
All right, thank you for the introduction, Charles. I very much appreciate the time today, and for everyone that's joined the call, I am looking forward to walking through really the kick-ass culture. I think we're gonna try to say that as much as possible. We never get to swear in these webinars, so it's certainly nice to be able to talk about that culture experience that we're trying to create for not only here at Outmatch, but for you guys looking to learn a little bit more about our approach and some best practices here today. So what I'd like to do is walk through just high level what I'll be talking about today so you know what to expect during the presentation. I'm going to start with a definition around guest experience and just really a level set around the definition we're really working from. We'll walk through just a couple of brand examples that exemplify guest experience and customer focus as well. From there, I'll walk through the meat of the presentation today around that, how to build that company culture around, again, that kick-ass guest experience, and how to hire for employees who really rock at that guest experience component. As Charles mentioned, we'll leave time at the very end for Q&A. If you have questions along the presentation, we do have a chat feature. Charles will be monitoring that, so we'll be able to stop and ask questions. And certainly feel free to raise your hand should you want me to clarify or you have a follow-up question for me along the way. Okay, so let's start with that definition around guest experience. So guest experience for us, and knowing that we have several clients in the retail and the hospitality restaurant industry, it really is the concept of customer loyalty and customer focus. So for those of you who may not be in these industries, but maybe more tech focused or thinking about customers in a different way than guests, it's really coming back to that customer loyalty standpoint. So knowing that we're trying to provide a stellar customer service, whether it's a product or a service that you provide, tech or restaurant industry, there's kind of a couple of hallmarks that we see across our experience and client base that really highlight those who are great at customer or guest experience. One of those being, first and foremost, that friendliness component. Every time a guest or a customer interacts with you and your brand, having that friendliness, that warm experience is really a hallmark for those that have a strong guest experience. We're in a go world these days, so speed is certainly another hallmark that we see for cultures and the definition around a quality guest experience and stellar customer service. So getting to the customer, meet them where they are, and not really allowing a whole lot of lag time between your response and your interaction with that customer or guest. The quality of that experience is certainly another big hallmark of guest experience and a defining component. So the quality of your product, the quality of the service, the quality of really the entire experience overall. And from a reliability standpoint, what you see from a guest experience definition is that it's not enough just to be fast and nice. You certainly have to be consistent and reliable over and over. So knowing what customers or guests are walking into your environment or interacting with you on any kind of medium in which they will reach you, that reliable and consistent experience is another way that they know exactly what they're getting from you every time they interact with you. And then finally, really around this last component here is that convenience factor. So making it easy to get with you, making it easy to reach you, and not having to go well out of their way to get a hold of someone should there be something they want to talk about on a positive note. And unfortunately, sometimes we get these, but the complaints are issues that they're running into. So that full guest experience is really around these 5 core components from a definition standpoint. And for us, whether you're calling it guest or customer, even associate experience, this is certainly something that we wanted to lay as the foundation for our discussion today. Okay, when thinking about brands that really exemplify this guest experience, and these certainly aren't comprehensive of Outmatch's clients, but we know when you do a quick even Google search here, we've got those that come top of mind. And even as consumers ourselves, it doesn't matter what you're thinking about here, but as you think about those big guest experience brands, things like the technology companies around Amazon and Netflix truly have this core component around their customer service and customer focus. For those of you that may not live in the South or are not used to Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A is a brand that I hold near and dear to my heart as I would call myself a high user of Chick-fil-A, but their customer service going through the drive-through line or even going into the restaurant itself, having that warm and friendly interaction. They will literally chase you down the street through the drive-through if they forgot to give you the ketchup. That really true exemplary guest focus is all is consistent no matter which restaurant you go into for that brand. When it comes to Disney, it's all about that experience from the interaction from the technology side, whether it's walking into a retail store or visiting the amusement park or even watching the movies. It's a truly branded and a consistent experience across the board and really focused on that customer, that guest at the heart of it. And for those of you who are frequent flyers, that Southwest mentality of having love everywhere they go, whether it's through their own employees and their flight attendants and gate agents, all the way down to your own experience flying with them in the air, it's truly embedded into their entire culture around that guest experience. So those are just a couple examples. Again, not a comprehensive list or a top 5 list by any means, but if you want to think about what we're really trying to, from an aspirational standpoint, think about these brands really stand out to us here. When I think about those common themes, really, for these brands, it's not just about that culture code. They're very intentional about their culture, but the consistent components within that is that they have those people-centric values. You can see it in the way they treat their own employees and the way they also treat their customers. So it's really all about that hallmark and that mentality of taking care of their employees first. And that guest experience just, again, starts at the very top and trickles down to their employees, and from there gets down to those guests or those customers. From a guest experience is really tracked and measured very consistently. So people can't meet those goals, or they can't play the game if they don't know the goals. And having the ability to track from a metric standpoint, from a company standpoint, and an individual standpoint, those metrics components are really core to the company's mission and philosophy, because they can go back down to the level and track exactly how they're going to meet those goals. So not only is it embedded in their culture from that people-centric values, but they're also using metrics to see how closely they are aligned with that guest mentality or customer mentality. And more importantly, and really what I wanted to hit home on today is about this, some of the project work that I've been doing with some of our clients and really over my career is thinking about how to hire only those kick-ass employees who have the kind of the hardwire mentality or those personality components that make them just natural game changers when it comes to guest focus. And on top of that, when you are building a customer-obsessed or guest-obsessed culture, you want to get that right employee culture fit. And part of that is using a couple of steps we'll talk about here later in the presentation to do that. But we certainly want to make sure that we're hiring for the right kind of people here. And not only are companies that do this very well hiring for those employees who have a great customer or guest culture fit or a behavioral fit, they're quick to fire those or let go of those who just don't fit in with that culture. So not really allowing people who don't blend in or can't really meet the customers where they are, of making sure that they're being intentional about their culture, about who they're bringing in, but also being intentional about who doesn't fit. When I was preparing for this webinar, I have a pretty long commute into work. I don't know if any of you on the phone can relate to that, but I listen to a lot of podcasts, and one of the ones I recently listened to is one by Gimlet Media called Without Fail. And they had Patty McCord on that podcast, and she was talking a lot about Netflix and Netflix Culture Deck and how Netflix came to be one of the culture code hallmarks that we all reference. There is a presentation that still lives on the internet today from 2009, about a decade ago, and it's really, from my perspective, something that I viewed back, a decade ago. But thinking about, this podcast was really talking around how Netflix was very intentional about their culture. They started as a startup, a tech company about renting DVD movies, and Patty was in that podcast talking about how they wanted to be so intentional about the culture that they were going to build an organization that would be a place that they would want to work. So this culture deck really threw out all the rules. They knew they were going to grow, or they had the aspirational mentality to be publicly traded one day, but they didn't want to go down the path of necessarily creating a handbook that had a bunch of rules and policies and procedures that can really bog down a culture sometimes. So as Charles mentioned here, we're going to be offering a hand guide or a resource for you at the end of today's presentation about how to build a culture handbook. And if you're looking for a great example of this, no matter what industry you're in, you don't have to be a tech company like Netflix in order to think about this in a different way, but they really turned all the rules on its head to think about how they can be intentional and how they can remove that complexity out of their culture as they grow. And a bottom line here, this podcast was really all about how they removed barriers and allowed that freedom for their employees, and that culture and that mentality of treating their employees and their own associates with that kind of trustworthiness and respect. It really allowed them to flourish, be more productive, be more creative, and streamline that process so they could provide the ultimate customer and guest experience. And so their philosophy is all about that people over process, and they wanted to create dream teams to meet not only the customers where they're at, but those wide and large goals that they had as an organization could be met by having that level of trust. And that knowing that people thrive on freedom and are worthy of freedom is really, really important to Netflix and that culture deck. And I encourage you guys to go through that to get a sense of what it looks like. But it really is something that I think is a good hallmark for those of you who are thinking about being intentional around a guest or customer focused culture. This is all about putting those people first, and not just your customers, but your employees as well. Another example around how to be intentional about your culture and culture code. I'm a big fan of HubSpot. I've been to their conferences a couple of times. They're an inbound marketing firm, but they also kind of took what Netflix did and took it a step further and modernized it for a different kind of industry. So they are all about culture and very intentional themselves, and they know that culture doesn't just help attract amazing people to their company, but it amplifies their ability to do good work. So HubSpot, having a large client base in that marketing industry, they're very, very specific about what they want. And at the hallmark, similar to what Netflix did here, they put those people over perks, people over process, and they wanted to really set that culture on a very clear tone for anyone that's thinking about using HubSpot from a client perspective or coming to work from them. That culture code is very, very much embedded to everything that they do. So Charles mentioned that he's going to share these links and resources. I'm not going to walk through Netflix's SlideShare from 2009 or HubSpot's culture code. It's worth a look if you're looking for a good place and a good example to start, in addition to the 7 steps that we'll share today in today's presentation. But I highly do encourage you guys to take a look at that as well. So for those of you who may not have a desire to rewrite your employee handbook or create a culture code, there are several ways that I'll also talk about, ways that you can get guest focused or guest experience into your organization. Many of you may be familiar with competency models, but here at Outmatch, we're a personality shop. So a lot of the work that I do with my customers and clients is focused around creating a behavioral set that helps us measure some of those cultural aspects that we're really trying to achieve, but also create hiring profiles and development tools and resources really around those goals and those values. So having a competency model in place allows us to set those job expectations and success criteria very clearly. It creates that foundational language and that common language across the individuals in your organization, from individual contributor or the store level or restaurant level, all the way through that top line leadership. So having that common language allows for your culture and your employees to be thinking about and talking about the same thing. A competency model that includes things like guest focused or customer service or customer focus does set that clear expectation and targets. And that integration around the overall mission and strategy all the way down to the behavioral level allows organization to have that guest focus. So if you don't already have guest focus in your competency model, I imagine that you do. It's certainly something to think about, making sure that it's not just part of the culture code, but it's really embedded into your talent management processes as well. And that can happen from that pre-hire standpoint, from a personality assessment or a behavioral assessment, your interview guides, down to your performance reviews, and all the way through executive coaching and management. So a couple of guest focus and guest experience competencies that I've worked with recently is all about engagement and care, member service, and customer focus. So engagement care is really all about thinking about not only the associates in the organization, but taking care of people for a particular club. And that's really a mentality that for that organization, engagement and care is all about that focus and mentality around the guests, the customers, and the associates. It really is a true leads through the organization. You can see it when walking through the doors there. From a member service perspective, that is something that you might be able to tell that is another type of, outside of the restaurant world, another type of club or a mentality that people have coming to the table of, I've got members, they're not just people that walk in our door, they're not just paying customers, they're truly here to have an entire experience. And that member focus or that member service is certainly something that is a core component to that model. And then finally, customer focus is another name of that competency, but regardless of what you call it, we're all getting at the same kind of behaviors that underlie these competencies. And from a perspective of hiring for customer and guest focus, Charles mentioned when he was introducing me for this webinar that I've worked on a couple of projects with some clients around tailored profiles or customizing a profile for organizations that are really looking to bring in the right people into the door from the very start. So knowing that guest or customer focused or customer experience is truly embedded into the culture, they have a handbook written for that, they've been intentional about their culture, and they want to make sure they're bringing in the right people. What we're doing here with our clients at Outmatch is that we have the ability to assess an individual's innate personality traits. And what is important, even though an organization might call it member service or customer focus or engagement and care, we know from our 30 years of research that there are a couple personality traits and there are ranges even within that profile that help us determine success for individuals. So again, we're looking at those innate characteristics, those abilities for people to really come to the table with the right kind of behaviors, but certainly not used as an end-all be-all. This objective information in the hiring process gives hiring managers and HR, even the talent management group, some insight to who's coming into your organization and who's going to be the best fit from the get-go. And we do this in a couple of ways. We have off-the-shelf profiles that have guest or member focus or customer focus embedded in the profile itself. We have the opportunity I was mentioning to take it a step further and collect data off of incumbents, to talk to subject matter experts and key stakeholders to say, tell me a little bit more about what this means for you. How can we truly customize this assessment and what we're asking from a guest focus and member service to ensure that that is prioritized in your hiring profile and the tools that you use to bring people into your organization. So really, we know that assessment is a large part of hiring these days. And the great thing and what I love about working at Outmatch is that it's so easy to use, and we're able to take it a step further. So even if you're not using a personality assessment, if you have an interview guide and you're using some kind of way to measure that guest focus, really being intentional about people who you bring into the organization is the key here.
So I have an audience question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so are the measurables kind of the same across hourly hires and professional?
They're not. That's a great opportunity. So that's something that, when I've worked on a recent profile, we've got the kind of an hourly level individual for one of the restaurant brands I'm working with today. So they have an hourly shift supervisor. And the traits and the ranges of success for that profile are different for, say, what we see at the GM or area manager level. At the heart of it, the definition is the same. We're looking for guest or customer experience, but the traits that you're seeing in this example report might be different, and these ranges of success will be different for the hourly level versus the higher level for a GM or an area manager. And that research for us allows us to tease that out through those focus groups and through the interviews, but also knowing that we have several cases and clients of data, we see that consistently. So we're able to level and look at the behaviors a little bit differently, knowing that it looks different from the top line and the bottom line.
Gotcha. And so my personal question is, how do you make sure that the culture is consistent across the different levels of the organization?
Yeah, so the culture is really all about that competency definition. So the consistency piece for us is about knowing that the behaviors and the traits might be slightly different, but overall what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to measure is the customer experience or the guest experience. So what an area manager might do to influence that guest experience might be more strategic and innovative and leading others to deliver that on the front line, say at the hourly shift level or a key card holder level. And so we know that influencing is a little bit different, but still gets at that guest focus because they're thinking about how they can motivate others to meet the ultimate goal. And that actually brings up a great question, because part of one of the results presentation I was conducting this week hit on just that. So we all, especially here in America and the US, we are very focused on results. And that is often a competency that's included in addition to guest experience or customer focus in many of the clients that I work with. And one of the things that we found as part of the study is that the results component is much lower rated as a predictor of success in their profile. And that was a little bit of a hurdle in our conversation because we're all about results, But when we talked through it, and from our perspective here, and my perspective in looking at the data, it's showing us at the higher levels, of course, the area managers and general managers and those that are the leadership level even above them, it is about results, but the way they get results is through that people-centric mentality. So when I was talking a little bit about earlier about putting associates first or people first, the way they get guest focus at that senior level leader or that higher level of a GM role is through their interactions with others, through that strategy and more of those people-related competencies versus truly just driving down to the hourly level and doing the same thing that they're doing there.
Thanks. So I actually think this might be a good place to pause and take a couple of audience questions because we do have quite a few that just came in. So I'll just read them off here. So Chris has a question on how many personality traits do you measure? Do you measure cognitive abilities?
Yeah, yep. So for us, we've got over 20 personality traits in our library. And for us, you're just seeing a snapshot of the personality traits that go into the sample of our off-the-shelf customer focus profile on the page that we're looking at here today. And so those traits can vary depending on the research that we conduct if we have a tailored profile process. For us, those ranges can get a little bit tighter or a little bit wider depending on that research. And yes, we do also measure cognitive abilities as part of our suite of offerings. Most of what we're talking about today here is that personality component, but we have a number of cognitive assessments that we layer on depending on the need for that assessment and the organization's desire.
Cool. Okay, so then follow up to that. What are typical correlations with performance achieved by your off-the-shelf and custom models?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's a great question. So for us that does depend a little bit on what we're seeing. So the correlation for my custom models, based off of a recent example I was just talking through, the correlations for that overall performance are right or under 0.3. So we're hovering around a 2.87 for that. So for our off-the-shelf, that is going to vary depending on the rest of the competencies that are in that profile. But we can be sure to follow up with you, Chris, on that question.
Cool. And then Samson has a question. Can you clarify the difference between engagement and care and customer focus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. So for that engagement and care competency, that is really related to customer focus in the way that the care component is truly around being even more of a service to that guest or that member. So customer service, you're right, sounds a lot like engagement and care, and it often is relabeled to what makes sense for the organization. But engagement and care for that particular organization, the underlying point of that is that it didn't stop just at the guest. It was all about even an individual contributor was responsible for taking care of the team and taking care of the support, no matter where you are in the level of the organization. It's not truly just about the external focus, it's also the internal focus as well.
Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so let's go back to our slides here. Go ahead and advance this.
Thank you. Perfect. So when I'm going through these tailored profile processes, or even having an opportunity to talk about clients or talk about this with clients that are looking to start a profile that has really a strong component around guest experience and guest focused in its competency model, I do have the opportunity to talk to a lot of people. And one of the quotes from a recent experience that really hit home for me around this club mentality is that when talking through those stakeholders, they really underscored the fact that the company takes care of them, and that allows them to feel empowered and that freedom to take care of the members and the customers. So going back to that engagement and care component, Chris, that you asked, or the question for the individual that asked on the line, that guest-focused culture really does start with how you're treating your employees. So it's one thing to say what you want done, but if you're not having that trust and that care or that mentality for your culture, it's going to be really hard for people to feel empowered to take care of the customers as well. I don't know if you've ever had an interaction with someone or a brand that's not so great at customer service or customer guest experience, but you can tell when someone's having a bad day or they're not really enjoying the place that they work. You can definitely get the sense of who has a better happiness level or engagement with their company versus those who are just there for the job. Okay. In addition to the behavioral assessment and really tracking towards a profile that can be used in the hiring process, another thing that I've seen done very well for organizations, not just here at Outmatch, but throughout my career in talent management, is that organizations that use engagement surveys or culture analytics tools to look at their culture, to get an understanding where their strengths and gaps are across the organization. So for us, I'd be remiss not to talk about something that we offer, and I promise this isn't a sales pitch, but I also do a lot of work with clients that do culture mapping and culture analytics. So part of that is one of 7 values is about that customer orientation. And you're seeing a sample report here on the slide, but basically this culture tool, and there are a lot out there, but this culture tool specifically gives us a sense to, gives us an ability to look at the aspirational culture. So those attributes or those values that the organization says they want to be or have, and then also bump that up against what the current employees are saying is actually valued. So it gives us an opportunity to see where those areas of alignment are between the aspirational goals of the organization and those areas where there is a little bit of a gap. So we're saying, for example, we might be really wanting that high customer orientation, but the GM level or maybe the hourly shift supervisor level is saying, you know what, I'm not seeing that as really valued in my organization. It's really more, or at my level, I'm really seeing the results driving a little bit harder here than that customer orientation. So we're being held accountable for how many rollers are on or hot dogs are on the rollers, or how fast we're getting the food out to the customers. But at the same time, that results metric is what's hitting home. We know that customer orientation is important, but I'm not seeing that as valued as, say, some of these other components. So this is just to say that there are other places and ways that you can measure culture and making sure that you're intentional about your culture. One of what we talked about was that culture code and creating a culture handbook. Another is hiring into your organization by using a personality profile or something similar to what Outmatch offers in that aspect. And then if you have the opportunity, another way to kind of follow on through that development life cycle is to get a pulse of what's going on in your culture, get that perception and that engagement component. All right. So it's one thing to walk the walk, but you certainly got to talk the talk too. So I talked a little bit about the beginning of with the brands that do this really well. They're very intentional about their cultures. They use tools along the way to make sure they're hiring the right people and developing the people in the right way by using a common language through a competency model or a personality profile. Then I also talked a little bit about that culture analytics tool or an engagement survey that you can get a pulse on how there are alignments or gaps in your organization, even by team or level, to get a sense of where you might focus some of the efforts to right the ship should you need to. But having an accountability through consistent metrics. I've worked with organizations that have scorecards on scorecards and metrics that they track over and over, but having a couple in your pocket, if you're not already tracking these, help get everyone on the same page, and get on the same page in the sense that we know that these metrics are often tied to customer satisfaction, and they're really around a couple of different ways to track that customer and guest focus. So many of you may have heard of Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and that's really all about the kind of a growth indicator. It's that customer satisfaction metric that helps you find out how satisfied customers are, but more importantly, how likely they are to promote them to their friends, to their family, to anyone on the street, to see a little bit about how likely they are to share their experience with others. When it comes to a customer satisfaction score, or CSAT, it's really all about how customers and clients or guests are satisfied with a certain service or an interaction they recently had. So a CSAT question is really all about, how was your experience? How would you rate your interaction with us today? And it's really a quick way for you to get that metric. And then another example of an accountability metric for customer and guest satisfaction is about the customer effort score. And I really like this one because it does give us a sense of how hard or how easy it is to interact with your brand or your product or your experience. So, from a restaurant standpoint, I get this one a lot because I order from my phone quite a bit, especially from Chick-fil-A, because they have the best little mobile ordering that I've had, especially with the little one in the backseat of my car. But having that pop up as soon as I get my chicken nugget meal to my son, getting asked, how easy was it for you to pick up your mobile order today? And hitting 5 is something that I like to do because I know how important that customer effort score really is for their tracking. Okay. So in sum, you're thinking about that being intentional about your culture, but I wanted to highlight and recap some of the things that I talked about today. One of the first things that you want to think about when defining your guest experience and your kick-ass guest experience culture, you got to think about that ideal guest experience in mind. You got to think about your customers first and foremost. Although I did talk about HubSpot's culture code at the very beginning, they have some great worksheets on their website about thinking about your customers and your ideal buyer or your ideal guest. And having who they are in mind can help you inform the ideal guest experience you want to provide for that type of customer. And from there, making sure that that guest or customer experience is central to your values, your competency model, and your culture handbook. Provided a couple of examples of that, if I were in your shoes, I'd be using to start from, and maybe even make edits from your existing guide. And then as specific as you can be, outlining any actionable behaviors, whether it's bullet points or sub-competencies or examples of exemplary employees that highlight some of those behaviors you want to see. Anything that you can do to be more specific and more relevant to your organization, the more likely people are to model those behaviors moving forward. And then hiring and demanding accountability. Those are two pieces that I think we often talk a lot about, but the ways in which we do that really matters. So demanding accountability through consistent metrics, satisfaction surveys, and trying to minimize the amount of goals we're kind of oriented to. So knowing that results is really important here in the Western world. It's not to say that we can't achieve results by doing a little bit less. From hiring from guest focus perspective, we talked a lot about using a personality profile, competency model, structured or behavioral interview questions to get at the innate characteristics and tendencies that we all bring to the table, whether you're a customer or you're a hopeful employee to one of the brands that we talked about today. I certainly think that hiring for guest focus is a good way for you bringing in the right people in the organization. And finally, for me, I can't stress this enough because I am a true believer in this, that if you are going to be guest focused, you really have to be people focused. And people focused meaning treating your employees with that open-ended, that trust and accountability, and not really being top down in the rule book here. So throwing some of the rules out the window, simplifying where you can, and providing that level of trust and care to your organization might actually free you up to have individuals who are going to meet the customers where they need because they feel that autonomy, they feel happier and more satisfied in their roles. And then, if you take care of your own first, everything else will fall in line. So that really sums up best practices. And, I like this quote because I think it summarizes exactly what we were talking about here today. But customers and guests may never forget what you said, and they may forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's all about that experience. So again, appreciate everyone's time today. I think we're going to open it up to some questions here, and happy to go into the Q&A part.
Cool. Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so I have one question right now. If you have some questions, please send them in to us using the questions queue, and we'll make sure that we get to them. We've got some time. We've got 20 minutes we could use if we need it. So definitely get those questions into us, and we'll make sure to get to them. So the first question I have is, when making a culture shift, do you think it's more important to start culture change pre-hire or post-hire?
That is certainly something that it depends on the setup of your organization. So I'm working with a client right now, or a company right now, that is being really intentional about that culture shift. So they don't necessarily want to bring in individuals into the organization that don't meet that culture mentality. But in addition to that, they have a very wide communication plan and an education plan for their employees across several countries to level set and have culture education workshops. So they are really setting them up for success, because what you don't want to happen is bring in people who fit with your ideal culture, but your culture hasn't made that shift yet. So that's going to be kind of an area or a gap. So if you bring in people who you say you want, but you're not ready to support them or meet them for those values and behaviors that they bring to the table, that's going to be a mismatch and misalignment, and that could cause people to top out or fail. So from my perspective, if you're ready and your organization has already started the work of a culture education and a very intentional shift, yes, bring in the people that have that culture fit mentality will be appropriate. But if you haven't quite made it there, I would start first with that education. I would start first by being intentional with changing your culture, and then gradually bring people into the organization that fit and are more aligned to that culture.
Yeah, so we've got a couple more questions in here now. Is there a difference between hiring for culture fit versus hiring for behavioral fit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for culture fit and behavioral fit, there is a little bit of a difference. So from a culture standpoint, I might be motivated and really want to work in an organization from a desire standpoint that has a high trust, or has a high guest focus, because I really value people. I'm a people-centric person from a value standpoint. So that culture fit is all about that motivator standpoint and about what I value as a worker and as an employee, and even as a manager, for example. But just because I value something and it's important to me intrinsically, it may not be how I behave. So we're all human beings, and so there might be an opportunity for us to say what I want out of life and what I want out of my work environment might be different than the way I actually behave. So from a behavioral standpoint, a behavioral fit assessment can give us the sense of those traits and those behaviors that people bring to the table, whether they're going to communicate effectively or have that accommodation or desire to help others. From a behavioral standpoint, that is the kind of the innate ways they can get those needs or those values met. So for us, when we talk about behavioral fit, we're really centering on those behaviors that people come to the table with, that give them a sense of how they're likely going to act, whereas culture fit is going to give you a sense of what they value and what's important to them from a different perspective.
Okay, I've got one more question here. Do you have a 360 or 180 degree leadership survey?
Yep, that is definitely part of our assessment, our product suite. We have a 360 survey that we offer. And that is something that can get at your own custom competencies, but is another way for you to get a real-time feedback of not just how people are innately hardwired for this, but how that's actually playing out in real time based off of observed behavior.
Cool. As you were answering that question, we got two more questions. Mm-hmm. So is culture as predictive as behavior? Yeah, is culture as predictive as behavior is the question.
Yeah, it is kind of a barometer, though. So, you know, for organizations that have, and if you're talking about more from a predictive as far as correlations, I don't have that answer for you today. But I do know that from for behavioral assessments, we are we are seeing very strong relationships with performance. And from a culture fit standpoint, we're not using that as a knockout or a screen-in process. It's, for us, it's really a data point for us to get more interview questions in a sense outside of the behavioral components that how well they are going to be that culture fit. So it's really another tool in the toolkit and provides that incremental validity into your process. But from a culture standpoint, we know that they're getting at slightly different things, but we want to say, we kind of want both, but ultimately if you have a strong culture, the culture fit is going to be just as important as a behavioral fit.
Thank you. Okay, so I've got another question here. How easy is it to promote a staff-centric culture, somewhat caring for the employees as well as firing those who do not fit? How do these organizations manage morale of staff still in service when one of their close associates has just been fired?
Oh yeah, that is so difficult. And that podcast I was talking to you about with Patty McCord and Netflix, the title of that is How to Fire People. And that's because they talk about not just about the culture code and how intentional they were about having an employee and a customer focused culture, but how they approached people letting go that needed to be let go and take care of those that stood. But all it comes down to for that a particular example, and in my worldview from Cheryl Oxley personal view, is that clear expectation of we're not gonna do this dance if you're not a fit here. And even if you have been a fit here, it may be time for you to move on for a couple of reasons. And knowing that everybody is on the same page is that it's one thing to be a family, but it's quite another to be a team. And that podcast talks a lot about the difference between family and team, because we do spend a lot of time at work. We spend sometimes more time at work with our work family than we do at home with our real family. So knowing that when we're terminating and letting people go because they're not good culture fits, or perhaps their skill set is no longer needed as the organization, having that clear expectation about where we are as an organization or where you are as an organization is important. That podcast does a much better job about talking about that mentality, and I encourage you to listen to it.
Cool. That actually brings us to the end of our Q&A session.
Okay. I love these questions. You guys, you really asked some good ones today.
All right. So, so I just want to first off, thank you, Cheryl. I really appreciate the great insights that you gave me and the audience today. Super insightful, awesome stuff. And I also want to thank our audience for attending today's presentation on how to build a kick-ass guest experience culture. We'll continue the conversation about hiring and developing the right people in our next webinar. We'll also talk about the ways to drive employee growth and boost promotability of hourly and entry-level employees. So don't miss our webinar on how to hire people who will succeed in their next 3 roles next month. And so you can go to our webinar page and get registered. I'll also send out an email here in the next week or so that those of you who attended today can also have a registration link to that webinar. If you want to listen back to any of our previous webinars, you can go to outmatch.com/webinars, or you can email me at csummers@outmatch.com. All right, we will see you all next month. Thank you.